Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webcast titled State Legislation on Ocean and Coastal Acidification. This webcast is sponsored by EPA's Watershed Academy in the Office of Wetlands, Ocean, and Watersheds, also known as OWOW, in EPA, in partnership with the Coastal States Organization. I am Holly Galavati in EPA's Ocean and Coastal Management Branch. Thank you all for joining us today. The slides for today's webinar are available now on your webinar panel in the handout section. They will also be available on EPA's Watershed Academy webcast webpage with the URL www.epa.gov/watershedacademy. This webcast is being recorded and will be archived for later viewing, also on the Watershed Academy webcast page. Participants are eligible to receive a certificate for their attendance at the end of the webcast. Directions for obtaining the certificate will be presented at the conclusion of the presentation. I would like to briefly summarize some of the features of today's webcast and touch on a few housekeeping items. We hope you will have a lot of questions. Please type in your question in the questions panel on your GoToWebinar control panel and click on the send icon. If you have any problems viewing the broadcast, just let us know in the same questions box and we will post an answer to that same box. Today's webcast will have a question and answer session in the beginning. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. However, due to the high number of participants, we will not be able to respond to all questions. We encourage you to contact speakers after the webcast if you have any unanswered questions or would like to follow up about their presentation. We will provide the speaker's contact information on one of our final slides. Lastly, the materials in this webcast have been reviewed by US EPA staff for technical accuracy. However, the views of the speakers and the speakers' organizations are their own and do not necessarily reflect those of US EPA. Mention of commercial enterprises, products, or publication does not mean that US EPA endorses them. Now that we have completed the discussion of housekeeping items, let's kick off the webcast. We would like to begin with a few polls. First, we would like to know what type of organization are you with? Federal, state, non-governmental organization, private, or other. Please select a response on your screen so we can have a better idea of who is joining us today. Okay, let's broadcast the results. Okay, it looks like 40% of you are joining us from state, followed by 16% from federal, 14% NGO, 12% private, and 18% other. Great. Next, we would like to know how aware are you of potential ocean and coastal acidification impacts in your state? Would you consider yourself very aware, somewhat aware, or not aware? I'll give you a few seconds to select a response on your screen. Okay, let's show the results. Okay, so 48%, almost half of you are somewhat aware, followed by 39% very aware and 13% not aware. Great, very educated audience. Okay, the third question is, we would like to know what brought you here today. Are you new to this topic? Are you looking to include ocean and coastal acidification in your current work? Or are you currently working on ocean and coastal acidification issues? Please select an answer so we can see who is joining us today. Okay, great, let's see the results. Okay, very evenly split audience. So 36% want to include ocean and coastal acidification in your work, 30% new to this topic, and 33% currently work on this issue. Great. Okay. The next poll question is, how many years of experience do you have working on ocean and coastal acidification? Please select either 0 to 1 year, 2 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, 10 to 20 years, or more than 20 years. Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so we have 50% of the audience is very new to this issue and 0 to 1 year working on this. Great. Okay, the last poll question is, if you are affiliated with a state program, what is the major source of funding used for ocean and coastal acidification monitoring programs? Is it a state general fund, user fees, voter registration fees, federal dollars, or something else? Okay, let's see the results. Okay, so 25% use the state general fund, 32% federal dollars, 34% other. Very few states are using fees to fund monitoring. Great. Okay, well, let's get to today's presentation. During this webinar, you will hear from 3 states who have successfully enacted state legislation on ocean and coastal acidification, as they share their experience and discuss actions that have been implemented to address acidification in their state. Each of our highly esteemed speakers shown on this slide will be introduced before their presentation. And first, I would like to introduce Mike Molnar. Mike is CSO's Deputy Director. Mike serves as the expert resource on state coastal management programs by supporting CSO work with states and territories, NOAA, and other partners. Prior to joining CSO, Mike led the Indiana Lake Michigan Coastal Program as the program manager for 14 years. Past work also includes fiscal policy analysis for the Indiana legislature and environmental program analysis and evaluation for Florida legislature. Mike holds a BS from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and a Master of Public Affairs focused on environmental policy, science, and law from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University in Bloomington. Mike, take it away.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mike Molnar. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for our co-hosted webinar with the EPA Watershed Academy. Coastal States Organization is glad to be part of this effort today, and it's nice to see so many participants online today in these interesting times that we're seeing before us. I want to start off with just a brief background on CSO and our relationship with the EPA. The Coastal States Organization is celebrating our 50th anniversary this year, and we're a nonpartisan nonprofit that represents the nation's coastal states and territories on coastal management issues. Our members consist of governor-appointed delegates from the 34 coastal states and territories with approved coastal zone management programs. We at CSO support our members by maintaining a community of practice for coastal and ocean managers, and we work to leverage a network of national partners to support our member priorities. As part of that support, CSO has been partnering with EPA to strengthen federal and state collaboration to identify and act on coastal zone management program needs. As part of CSO's Coastal Hazards Planning and Adaptation Work Group, or CHIPA, we provide targeted efforts to share resources within and across federal and state agencies to support hazard mitigation and climate change adaptation. Specifically, we recently hosted a learning exchange webinar for our state coastal program partners through our Coastal Hazards Planning and Adaptation Work Group, and it featured 2 EPA staff members who discussed and shared results of the study on long-term ocean acidification in MEPs. Our goal is to leverage information sharing opportunities such as this webinar to elevate and address coastal zone issues and increase awareness of relevant networks and tailored resources that meet state and territorial needs. Our members do have a demonstrated history of working closely together with EPA programs, including the National Estuary Program, and Holly will be speaking more to that program in a few moments. The coastal management programs, NAPs, do overlap geographically. 19 states and territories of Puerto Rico do overlap with NAPs, and in terms of shared priorities, they also do overlap on ocean and coastal acidification. Our members do collaborate with groups like the NAPs to coordinate on monitoring activities, conduct education and outreach with key stakeholders, and invest in restoration and mitigation activities. the coastal programs rely on quality data, like what is collected and analyzed by the NEPs, to inform their decision-making and policy development. In their most recent self-assessments, 17 of our programs identified acidification as a threat to living resources, especially shellfish. They also identified coastal water quality and connections to hypoxia and harmful algae. They also have considered actions to address the negative impacts of acidification on recreation and tourism. Of those 17 programs, 13 do overlap with an NEP watershed boundary. And we've heard that there's been some good active collaboration and coordination occurring between the NEPs and the CZ programs in those areas. We are especially excited about this continued effort, and especially highlighting the fact that the CZM and NEP work is additive and collaborative. We look forward to our continued efforts moving forward, and I especially look forward to hearing all the great information today from the speakers and the questions that ensue regarding ocean and coastal acidification. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, I'll stop blabbering on and turn it back to Holly. Thanks much.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Before we start with the speakers, I just want to give a quick overview of EPA's work on ocean and coastal acidification. I lead that program at headquarters, and our work is primarily focused on monitoring and research in estuaries and coastal areas, which are highly vulnerable to the impacts of acidification. There are gaps in our understanding of the extent of the vulnerability in estuaries and the anthropogenic drivers, such as nutrient enrichment, that can contribute to acidification. As Mike mentioned, EPA supports the advancement of coastal acidification monitoring by collaborating with the National Estuary Program, or NEP. The NEP is an EPA place-based non-regulatory program to protect and restore the water quality and ecological integrity of estuaries. As you can see in the map, there are 28 NEPs across the U.S. that are designated as estuaries of national significance. EPA funded 9 of these NEPs, which are circled with the red circle, to conduct long-term high-resolution monitoring using autonomous in situ sensors for dissolved carbon dioxide, or PCO2, and pH. These data are important to understand the variability associated with acidification and ultimately to inform mitigation and adaptation strategies in these estuaries. These sensors have been used extensively in the open ocean to monitor acidification. However, these NEPs are pioneering their use in the coastal environment, where there's very different conditions and challenges. At EPA, we are currently working with the NEPs to finish a report that summarizes the results, the preliminary results, lessons learned, and deployment methods for these 9 NEPs. And we hope to publish that report this year. In addition, we are working on taking a deep dive with that data from the NEPs and looking to see if we can compare and contrast the results across a region. So looking at East Coast data, Gulf of Mexico, and the West Coast data. And then finally, we are also working on developing a guideline on coastal acidification data management and data sharing, specifically using the continuous monitoring sensor data. Let me just move back. There we go. Okay, so those are the projects that we are working on with the NEPs with their coastal acidification monitoring. In addition to the monitoring work with the NEPs, EPA is also adding coastal acidification research parameter, which is total alkalinity, to EPA's 2020 National Coastal Condition Assessment. These alkalinity measurements will allow for a baseline understanding of coastal acidification buffering capacity for 750 sites across the contiguous U.S. Another major area of work is coastal acidification research, which is conducted by 2 of EPA's Office of Research and Development labs, one in Narragansett, Rhode Island, and the other one in Newport, Oregon. You may be familiar with that ORD recently released guidelines for monitoring acidification in coastal environments, which is a guideline that can be found on EPA's website on ocean acidification. Another resource that I want to mention to make sure everybody's aware of is the Ocean Acidification Information Exchange. This is an online forum to allow you to ask questions and collaborate with a broad community of practice working on ocean and coastal acidification. It was a product of the Interagency Work Group on Ocean Acidification, which EPA and other agencies participate, which is led by NOAA. For today's webinar, we will be focusing on state legislation on ocean and coastal acidification, which has been critical for states to promote local action, strong partnerships, and solutions to tackle the impacts of acidification. This map that you see here, Ocean Conservancy was generous enough to share with us, which depicts states that have passed legislation on ocean and coastal acidification and states which have introduced such legislation and are working to get it passed. Today we will hear from 3 states that are leaders on this topic: Maine, Oregon, and California. I want to mention Washington State is also a leader, as they have witnessed such impacts occurring on their shellfish industry. In 2012, Washington created the Washington State Blue Ribbon Panel on ocean acidification to chart a course for addressing the causes and consequences of acidification. As you can see from the map, there are states across the nation who have taken action to put a focus on ocean and coastal acidification to protect their coastline. So I look forward to hearing from our panelists today. I would like to introduce our first speaker, Justine Kimball. Justine is a senior scientist with the Ocean Protection Council, or OPC, with the California National Resources Agency. She's OPC's climate change program, which focuses on ocean acidification, sea level rise, coastal resiliency, and other issues related to the impacts of climate change to California's ocean and coast. Prior to joining OPC, Justine spent 5 years in Washington, D.C. at NOAA's Coral Program as a Knauss Fellow at the Office of the Oceanographer of the Navy. Justine earned her PhD from Stanford University, studying deep sea corals in the Pacific Ocean, and her BA in biology with a major in geology from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Justine, take it away.
Great, thanks. Hopefully you can hear me. And thanks for having me. As introduced, I'm Justine Kimball, and I'm with California's Ocean Protection Council, and I'll be talking to you today about ocean and coastal acidification legislation, policy, and actions in California. If I advance the slide, there we go. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Ocean Protection Council, or OPC, we are nested within California's Natural Resources Agency. We are a cabinet level office, and our executive director, Dr. Mark Gold, serves as Deputy Secretary for Ocean and Coastal Policy. We were created by legislation to be the advisor to the governor and legislature on ocean and coastal issues. And as our name implies, we are governed by a council. These are our 7 members from state agencies, the legislature, and the public. All of our work, priorities, and funding goes through them. This is the legislation that created OPC, the California Ocean Protection Act. Sets our mission to ensure healthy, resilient, and productive ocean and coastal ecosystems for the benefit of current and future generations. Science and the use of best available science is central to our mission and everything that we do. And we do our work through developing policy guidance and documents, funding and promoting science in all aspects of management and decision-making partnerships. OPC doesn't actually have any management or regulatory authority, so we work hand in hand with our agency partners, such as the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the State Water Resources Control Board, the Coastal Commission, state parks, among other state agency partners. And then funding, we have funding through a variety of sources to support our work. So because of this mission and the recognition that ocean acidification poses a serious threat to our coastal and ocean resources, OPC has been increasingly involved in OA-related efforts over the last decade. We supported the West Coast Science Panel. We were founding members of the International OA Alliance, among many other actions. For the purposes of this talk, I'm going to highlight a few milestones. First, some key legislation that was passed in 2016. So first, not specifically OA related, but I wanted to highlight this legislation in recognition that the only real long-term solution to ocean acidification is decreasing carbon emissions. California is a leader on this, and we've passed landmark legislation in 2006 and 2016 to significantly decrease all our sources of greenhouse gas emissions. In this vein, all of the work that we do on OA and the science that comes out, we try to message that to further strengthen the case to limit greenhouse gas emissions so as to better protect our marine ecosystems from all the impacts of climate change, including ocean acidification. Now for two pieces of legislation that were passed, also in 2016, specifically related to OA. SB 1363 created the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Reduction Program within OPC. It focuses on research, restoration, and conservation of submerged aquatic vegetation, particularly seagrass. As a result of this legislation, we funded demonstration projects related to the quantification of the ability of seagrasses to buffer OA and store carbon. We're now looking to compile and synthesize this research along with other studies to create sort of standardized accounting methodology related to OA and carbon dynamics in wetlands and seagrasses that we can use to inform efforts going forward. And then AB 2139 is the other. Sorry, I couldn't find a better picture. This legislation directs OPC to establish an ocean acidification and hypoxia science task force to provide advice and recommendations for further actions that may be taken to address ocean acidification and hypoxia in California and along the West Coast. So we convened the task force in 2018. Here are our members. We are very fortunate to have such a dedicated group of experts devoting some of their time to this effort, and we're very thankful for that. They focus on various topics of priority to OPC and just generally are experts who advise us and we turn to for guidance. Currently, they're conducting a gaps analysis on monitoring efforts to support California's state needs. They're considering monitoring already occurring and then prioritizing gaps in monitoring needs from that. So they're in the process of finalizing this report, and it'll be shared publicly this summer. And this is an example of the sort of support that allows us to be more confident in the priorities and the projects that we pursue. So that's all the legislation I'm going to cover. I'm going to now focus on some of the policy documents that we have that are governing our priorities and efforts now and going forward. Our next big milestone was in late 2018 when our council adopted the California Ocean Acidification Action Plan. The action plan is a 10-year vision designed for integration into public agency operations. It was developed with input from over 60 experts and our science task force. As I mentioned, it was released in late 2018, and we're in implementation phase now, which I will discuss more. I'm not going to cover everything that's in the action plan because there's a lot beyond introducing the 6 themes that structure it, which are prepare for the full range of OA risks and impacts, activate responsible elements of state government, reduce the pollution that causes OA, deploy living systems to slow OA and store carbon, build resilience to affected communities, industries, and interests, and engage beyond state boundaries. And then we have much supporting information and actions and goals within each of those themes. So you can Google the action plan and it's freely available on our website. It's a really ambitious plan, and I was excited to come aboard in this position when it was recently adopted but it's also sort of so comprehensive that I was having a hard time envisioning what implementation looked like. So luckily, we adopted a strategic plan just a few weeks ago, and in that, we've been able to fine-tune our priorities around OA and create actionable targets supported by the goals and the information within the OA action plan. So our strategic plan, as I mentioned, was adopted in late February. The first goal is around safeguarding our coastal and marine ecosystems in the face of climate change, and the second objective in that section is minimize causes and impacts of ocean acidification. The first objective is around sea level rise. So I'm going to spend the rest of my time introducing the OA-related targets, projects, and science that we've already funded in this objective, and then any next steps that we have planned within it. So our first target related to OA is target 1.2.1, which is based on the latest scientific research, advanced adoption of regulations as needed, establishing water quality criteria for OAH by 2025, with the scientific analysis of the relationship between nutrients and OAH impacts completed by 2022. This target closely follows the work that OPC has already invested in to build a state-of-the-art coupled physical and biogeochemical and lower ecosystem model for the California current. This mechanistic numerical model is needed to disentangle OAH natural variability, such as upwelling, from global climate and from the anthropogenic nutrient inputs that we're interested in here. So we can ask and answer the question, do nutrient inputs have an effect on OAH beyond what is expected with natural variability such as upwelling and from global climate change? We can then separate and try to find this distinct signal from nutrient inputs on ocean acidification and hypoxia values. So preliminary results from the Southern California Bight, which is just the portion of Southern California from Point Conception, north of Santa Barbara, down to San Diego, we focused in on that area, have demonstrated that additional nutrient inputs from wastewater treatment plants do stimulate nearshore primary production, acidification, and deoxygenation relative to an ocean-only forcing scenario. But further work really is still needed to better characterize and attribute those impacts. And then additionally, we need the biological linkage piece. What effect does this additional signal that we might see from nutrient inputs have on the biology? So we're mostly focused on species level at the moment because that's where the science seems to be at, but population, community, food web, and ecosystem impacts are all needed as well. So we're committed to continuing this work through supporting additional scenarios and understanding of that biological linkage piece. And then this information can be provided to the State Water Resources Control Board to support their regulatory decision-making process going forward. Target 1.2.4 is to work with partners and make targeted investments to support the development of an ocean acidification and hypoxia monitoring and observation system, optimized to deliver decision-relevant information that serves user needs by 2023. So this target comes directly from our OA action plan, recognizing that what we currently have is sort of a patchwork of assets and data streams and reporting in California, not a coordinated network that's analyzing and synthesizing this information for particular state needs. So previously, we've supported, along with our partners, an inventory of ocean acidification and hypoxia data sets from British Columbia to Baja, which is a really helpful start, but it doesn't get us to where we want in terms of analysis, synthesis, and reporting. So as I mentioned earlier, the Ocean Acidification Hypoxia Science Task Force is conducting a gaps analysis to prioritize monitoring information that meets knowledge gaps and needs for California, given the particular needs that we've identified. So this will inform what elements of the network should look like, but there's still another big step to coordinate all those pieces and define what a useful network is to us and our agency partners in the policy management and regulatory world. I see this target as a big lift in the next 3 years, and will take a lot of effort on the side of the state to refine and be really specific about what our monitoring needs are and in what form that information can best be used and applied by us. And then hopefully effort from our scientific community partners and others to better align ongoing efforts and future efforts with those needs. Target 1.2.4, again, it's part 2 of the previous target because it also comes directly from the OA action plan. It also overlaps a bit with the first target I mentioned and the need for a better understanding of the biological vulnerability and thresholds. In the previous case, we were applying that to the impacts of nutrient inputs, but in general, we recognize the need for a better understanding of biological vulnerability and thresholds for multiple and variety of purposes. Particularly, it's also critical to support socioeconomic research and then raise the alarm and message at what's at stake for us. So in some cases, we might have options for adaptation or mitigation as well, depending on the species and depending on what the predicted impacts would be for that. Target 3.1.4 is to work with partners to preserve the existing known 15,000 acres of seagrass beds and create an additional 1,000 acres by 2023. If this follows the seagrass legislation that I mentioned previously and our demonstration projects that we've funded towards seagrass and quantifying associated carbonate chemistry and carbon storage potential for seagrass in different environments and different geographies. So as I mentioned, we're interested in synthesizing all these research findings that are out there related to carbon storage and carbonate chemistry potential of submerged aquatic vegetation. Regardless of what those findings and results say, though, we see preservation and conservation, restoration of seagrass beds as a win-win for their multi-benefits. And then target 3.6.1 is to create an annual California State of the Coast and Ocean report starting in 2021 and a report card by 2025, utilizing a scientific indicator-based approach to grading the state of California's coast and ocean. This target is going to be another big lift for us, and OA is just one piece of it. We've heard from our council that they want to see a high-level report or dashboard that tracks the condition of California's coast and ocean. So we've committed to a report in 2021 and then a full indicator-based report card in 2025. So again, there's overlap here with the monitoring network target because this will be a state need and we'll need that consistent data analysis and synthesis and reporting to track and update any OA-related indicators that are developed. I don't know any other way besides monitoring, besides having a monitoring network to track and update indicators. So we're going to have to link those two efforts. And then hopefully it goes without saying that we hope to align with the ongoing work of partners and then along the West Coast regionally to develop and report on indicators. And then finally, just to loop back to our commitment and belief that our efforts and findings be messaged at all levels. In 2016, we were founding members of the International OA Alliance. The development of our OA Action Plan advances the goals of the OA Alliance, and we continue to support its great work across partners and borders to highlight the threat of OA to coastal economies and ocean ecosystems. Sorry, there's a delay in my mouse. It's not advancing. Oh, there we go. Okay, just advance. Okay, well, sorry, I didn't advance in time for my talking. And so with that, that is all I had. Thank you again.
Thank you, Justine. Oh, thank you so much. Excellent. I just want to take a second to remind you to go ahead and put in your questions in the question box. You can ask Justine. We're going to take about 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to go ahead. I've already got one question. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Justine, to what extent will the work on water quality targets in California be incorporated into the upcoming review of state marine protected areas?
Oh, you mean I'm assuming you're referring to the 2022 decadal review of California's marine protected areas. I don't think that this is going to be incorporated in that. The way that I'm understanding that review is going to go is it's really looking back at the MLPA, the Marine Life Protection Act, and the 6 goals within that established the Marine Protected Areas Network, and looking at that language and the monitoring associated with the MLPA, and matching those two things up. And so the inclusion of water quality, don't think is explicitly called out in that, but I know there's efforts, because when the MLPA was first put into place, there wasn't this explicit realization of climate change and the impacts of climate change to marine protected area performance and evaluation. So I know that there's an effort to incorporate climate change in the upcoming review, but I don't know to what extent ocean acidification and nutrients will be a part of that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for asking that. Could you say a bit more about how the OPC is funded?
Sure. So, like I said, we were created by legislation, the California Ocean Protection Act in 2004, and I think I've been here for about a year, so I'm still learning, but I think we've had a variety of funding sources over the year. My understanding is currently our main funding, I hope that's right, comes from the Environmental License Plate Fund, like our funding for our given office. It's like the license plates that have the whale tail on them, if you see them in California. And so that's where our office budget mostly comes from. And then funding for these various efforts, we do get money from bonds, propositions that are voted, that are voter approved. We get bond funds such as Proposition 1, Proposition 68, Proposition 84, all these propositions, these bonds, we've gotten some funding through. And then we do get a bit of discretionary funding through for marine protected areas in general from our general fund that goes to different state agencies.
Okay, great, excellent. Could you talk a little bit about if you are incorporating the restoration of kelp for OAH mitigation? I only heard you mention seagrass.
Yeah, our focus has been on seagrass because of the legislation and the findings of the West Coast panel, which seem to be much more focused on seagrass, but kelp has come up, and I've seen some promising findings from particular situations with kelp that are in areas of long residence times and things like that. I don't think we have any data right now to show that offshore in California, the kelp is having a buffering effect on its near surroundings, but it has come up. But yeah, I don't have anything to say specifically on that now, other than it is part of discussions, and we're looking to incorporate that as much as possible.
Okay, great. What are some other environmental interventions that California feels may be effective in improving local acidification impacts?
So most of them I mentioned, you know, in our targets. We are focused on nutrient and terrestrial local inputs from wastewater treatment plants and stormwater and runoff, and what that looks like for hotspots in localized areas. We also have a priority around like CO2 domes and what the effect of airborne CO2 is, and how we might be able to use research and findings on that to limit local coastal CO2 emissions, localized areas. Again, the use of submerged aquatic vegetation, the thoughtful siting of that in ways that is linked to particular species, life stages, biology is another tool. But a lot of our efforts really are, you know, characterizing the problem, better understanding the problem to message at a high level, so people understand this threat and can prepare for it as much as possible, and hopefully use that to, again, support emissions reductions.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Now, I still have some more questions for Justine, but we're going to save them to see if we have some time at the end. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Karin Brady. Let me just,
hi there.
Okay. Hi. Karin provides strategic leadership on all things ocean within the state of Oregon and across the West Coast as the manager of the Marine Resources Program for the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. Karin and her staff build partnerships with industry, academic researchers, tribal governments, agencies, stakeholders, and elected officials to collaboratively define and achieve both economic and ecosystem resilience. Her work is grounded in both fishery and economic and ecosystem issues, with a particular focus on changing ocean conditions, including ocean acidification and hypoxia. As co-chair of Oregon's legislatively created Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Coordinating Council and a council member on the Pacific Fisheries Management Council, Karin is helping West Coast communities and fisheries develop successful strategies to adapt to and mitigate ocean change. She received her doctorate from Stanford University's Hopkins Marine Station and has conducted scientific research from estuaries out to the deep sea hydrothermal vents of the Pacific Ocean. Karin's career began by toddling through West Coast tide pools from the time she could first walk. Take it away, Karin.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for including me in this great webinar today. I enjoy hearing different perspectives on the problems that we're all facing and continuing to share tools that we can borrow from one another as we're building solutions and policies across the country and in fact globally. So I am bringing a number of different hats to the webinar today, but I am going to try and focus on Oregon, both the context in which we're experiencing OAH impacts, as well as how we've moved forward. And I will touch on state legislation, which has been significant in our progress moving forward. but I'm not going to get into a lot of specifics about that. Like Justine, I'm going to focus maybe more specifically on how we are building aligned approaches across the West Coast and really using the ocean acidification and hypoxia action plan to focus on the ground efforts. So to begin with, I am going to talk about what we've all seen, and I can't help but start these types of talks just reminding myself and everyone I'm talking to about what we are experiencing today, and in particular recent collaborations across the West Coast and East Coast space on ocean and coastal states really has demonstrated to me that we're experiencing very different things in different parts of the world. And the West Coast and even the Hawaiian Islands, these time series shown here, are currently experiencing significant manifestation of ocean acidification. So this is something we're dealing with real time now, not something that we're projecting for the next decades and trying to prepare ourselves for. And so that's a different kind of situation. And it presents challenges in terms of understanding how to deal with those challenges, as well as opportunities to share lessons learned. And so hopefully there will be some of those as we kind of go through this. So like these graphs show, there is a very profound connection between atmospheric CO2 and what we're experiencing in terms of ocean chemistry. And on the West Coast, even though these data are quite old, the map on the right is from 2013. What we're experiencing is seasonal upwelling that for 3 to 4 to 5 months is presenting itself along the coast, which is our most productive portion of our federal EEZ access to ocean resources. And so these areas where we live, where we fish, where we recreate are the areas that are being impacted by the seasonal upwelling and decreasing pH and related metrics. So for Oregon, we really also are experiencing severe seasonal hypoxia, and deoxygenation or hypoxia is starting to become more part of the dialogue globally, but for Oregon and really into Washington as well in the last few years, we've experienced severe summer hypoxia events that are related to high productivity and then decomposition and usage of available oxygen that have really changed distributions of species at the very least, if not mortality of species in broad, wide sweeping areas of the shelf off the Pacific Northwest. So as I move forward through my talk, I am really going to combine these into ocean acidification and hypoxia. You won't hear me talk about coastal, but really I'm talking about all of that and changing ocean conditions generally. Also important context for Oregon is that we are part of the West Coast and particularly Pacific Northwest shellfish aquaculture industry, which is hundreds of millions of dollars annually, which is at risk from propagation due to the ocean acidification that we are experiencing now, and in fact have been experiencing for about 15 years now. So this is a story where we have a lot of jobs and resources at risk in coastal economies, and can be mitigated through different culture practices. And so it's really a canary in the coal mine story with a happy ending to a degree, in that in our on-land culture facilities can control and buffer chemistry successfully to continue the propagation systems in order to fuel shellfish aquaculture, where oysters are grown out in the estuaries and bays in Oregon, Washington, and California. But we're starting to understand the grow out operations may be detecting a difficulty even in adult or larger oysters, not just in the juveniles that are propagated in these terrestrial grow operations. So this is a successful story, but with an uncertain future as we move forward and ocean acidification worsens. I think the other thing that we know about the West Coast is that the food web is being undermined broadly throughout this EEZ space, and Nina Bednarsek, Dr. Richard Feely, and others have collaborated to describe the impacts they're seeing in the wild of pteropods, sea butterflies, the inset photo showing a pteropod that was collected and has pitting from ocean acidification from the wild. So this is not a lab experiment, but rather in situ effects. And the same group has now demonstrated impacts on Dungeness crab larvae. The paper just came out in January of this year and made quite a splash, both with the crab industry across the West Coast as well as managers. This is the first in situ evidence of impacts from ocean acidification. And by impacts, I mean correlation of impacts rather than cause and effect, but that work is still in progress and is likely to reveal serious vulnerabilities of this species. And like oysters, Dungeness crab is incredibly economically important. It's Oregon's single most important wild commercial fishery, very important for sport fisheries, and obviously is an important ecosystem species as well. For crab, the context relative to ocean acidification impacts in Oregon extends into this growing story that we're developing around biotoxin events, harmful algal blooms, and accumulation of biotoxins in seafood products, particularly, and thinking about public health, but in the ecosystem writ large. And the map shows the harmful algal bloom event in 2015, which was unprecedented previously, and I would argue is still causing problems in Oregon's ecosystem and food web today, 5 years later. Certainly last year, we were still seeing remnants of it. And so these massive biotoxin events that are facilitated by acidification conditions, certainly by warming and other aspects of warming, or excuse me, ocean change, are really facilitating the development of biotoxins, and that's propagating throughout the ecosystem and our system. So I'm going to give you a third way that Dungeness crab is connecting to ocean change impacts, and including acidification, but that connection has yet to be strongly correlated. But what we are seeing on the West Coast is that single pot fixed gear Dungeness crab pots, analogous to but much larger than the lobster pots on the East Coast, are increasingly interacting with humpback whales on the West Coast, right whales on the East Coast. For the West Coast, this story really started in 2015, the same kind of time frame that the biotoxin event really hit. And here, what we have observed, what we're piecing together, is that whale behavior essentially changed. And as we had the marine heat wave sweep across the West Coast, We had biotoxin events sweep across the West Coast. The forage for these baleen large whales moved their distribution. Not surprising, but guess what? So the whales followed the food, also not surprising. But it's also not something that we necessarily would project, that we would look into the future and say, what we need to plan for is humpback whales changing their behavior and following forage into different locations that's going to overlap more significantly with Dungeness crab fishing gear. But in fact, that is what seems to have happened, and humpback whales have been entangled at an order of magnitude greater frequency than prior to the marine heat wave. So now we have protected species that are being impacted by changing ocean conditions and affecting fisheries and economics, as well as the conservation of very important species. So it's with these kinds of stories running in the background of my head and within the discussions in Oregon and across the West Coast that we really talk about what actions should we be taking, and are those meaningful to address some of these really super big problems, massive problems that we're seeing as our ocean is changing. So as Holly mentioned, I'm with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. I manage a program that's about 1/10 of the size of the agency, and we're all focused on ocean management issues, from research to fisheries management, policy development, and so on. I am also a key contact for the governor's office and often represent the state on ocean acidification issues. And I get to work with Justine on a regular basis for our West Coast team of folks working on policy development and action. Oregon policy really, for me, falls into 3 buckets. 1 is legislative action, 2 is governor mandates, and 3 is agency policy. And within our mandates from the legislature and governor, we have discretion to develop policies in a variety of ways through our rulemaking body, and for ODFW, that's the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So obviously the focus of today's webinar is on legislative actions, and that has been very important in the state of Oregon. And so I'll describe this at a high level right now, but I'm going to focus on really a couple of products from the governor mandates, and then finish up with some discussion about agency action and legislative action that is upcoming. So while I'm paused on this slide, legislative policy has been important since Oregon was in the middle of discovering the problem with oyster aquaculture, and our legislature has invested a number of times in scientific research to figure out what that problem was and solve it, as well as install instruments to allow oyster aquaculture to continue and be productive. The legislature has also developed the Ocean Science Trust. California also has an Ocean Science Trust, which is much more developed and mature of an institution. But for Oregon, this is something we've been developing for about 5 years, and we are working on making that an effective way to help fund additional research projects and develop policy recommendations for the state on a variety of ocean issues. And that was created by the legislature. Additionally, the legislature created the OAH Council, of which I'm a co-chair with my colleague and co-chair Jack Barth, Dr. Jack Barth from Oregon State University. That council has been meeting since 2018. So we have, the Ocean Science Trust has been in existence for about 5 years. the state's been investing in ocean acidification issues since about 2006, and the council is the newest on the scene, having been in existence since 2018. So for governor mandates, I'm going to focus on two aspects. One is the PCC, and I'll start with that. And as Justine alluded to, the PCC, the Pacific Coast Collaborative, has been working for some time across the West Coast to coordinate on climate and energy issues generally. And one of the focuses of that group, foci of that group, has been in addressing ocean acidification specifically. And through the PCC governor's leadership and development, we have launched and now sent out into the global community this concept of an international alliance to combat ocean acidification, which has been a process that was started in 2016 and has made just amazing progress since then. The group is really organized around 5 major areas of action, and I wanted to describe this because it not only provides a framework for much of what Justine talked about, but is very much a framework for how Oregon has developed a series of actions moving forward. The first area is in scientific understanding. The second area is in reducing causes of ocean acidification, and you can build in there carbon dioxide emissions or excess carbon dioxide. The third is to look at resilience, adaptation, mitigation of the problems that we're seeing. The fourth is to expand public awareness, and the fifth is to build international support. And so the OA Alliance has many members. I believe our current tally is well over 80. We have a number of just really interesting things happening all over the world to achieve outcomes in those areas. The other thing that the Pacific Coast Collaborative has done, Justine's already touched on, which is this concept of thinking more collectively about what a monitoring network might look like, where we have capacity, where we don't have capacity, where we have priorities to fill gaps collectively. And this has been a topic of interest both with the PCC and then with a partnership that we built with the Interagency Working Group on Ocean Acidification, of which EPA, NOAA, and many other federal agencies are partners, and Holly already described that group. And the Interagency Working Group on OA has been very central to our thinking and our capacity to build on our thoughts about the inventory and gaps and building a stronger monitoring network on the West Coast. As Justine mentioned, the inventory covers Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And so it covers a very broad space, but we have some critical questions we need to address before we are going to be able to move forward effectively on filling gaps, and particularly actually defining what a regional gap looks like and how we can define that and effectively fill it with limited resources that are a common problem among all of us. So focusing now down into Oregon specifically, another governor mandate was to ask the legislatively created Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council in Oregon to build the governor's action plan in compliance or as a deliverable to the OA Alliance, or the International Alliance to Combat Ocean Acidification. So here, the action plan is built around the same 5 themes that are the OA Alliance themes: science and monitoring being the first, mitigation, reducing causes of CO2 and OAH is theme 2, theme 3, promoting resilience, theme 4, raising awareness, and theme 5, committing resources to action. So these phrasings are more appropriate at the state level versus the international level, but they essentially are intended to and incorporate the same concepts as the OA Alliance action plan guidance. So first, I wanted to highlight 3 areas, 3 of these themes with example projects or concepts as we're moving forward. And the first is in the monitoring and what we have done within the state of Oregon to address gaps. And this photograph is of an aerial photograph of Tillamook Bay, which Holly already mentioned is one of the National Estuary Partnership locations. And in fact, the Tillamook Estuary Partnership has been lead on establishing the first long-term monitoring in this very important Oregon estuary. It's Oregon's biggest estuary. It's very important for oyster aquaculture operations. And up until last year, 2019, did not have a dedicated monitoring station. I do want to very much call out the work of the Newport EPA lab in doing a significant amount of work on a very intensive and thorough project. They're still in the middle of that project in this estuary. And they have been very supportive of establishing just an ongoing oceanographic, basically a seabird data sonde type monitoring system for the Tillamook estuary. This is an example of how the action plan has helped us really kind of focus in on potential projects with actual partners and actual funding needs and getting work done on the ground to really kind of achieve some of these larger goals. So hats off to the EPA for their work there, as well as the National Estuary Partnership for continuing the good work that they've started. Yes, we will need more funding to keep it going in the long term, but I'll get to that in a minute. So another area where the Oregon OAH action plan is focused is in raising awareness. And this will be a key area of activity this year for the council. In addition to doing typical outreach events, the photo is showing an event 2 years ago at the Oregon Coast Aquarium, which sadly has just closed its doors to address the COVID-19 exposure issue. We have built a series of informational brochures to describe the problem of ocean acidification and impacts to species that Oregonians in particular care about. And we have established this year an education and outreach committee, which includes a lot of partners outside of OAH Council membership to bring in folks to really think about this much more broadly and over the next 5 years. The last one I wanted to touch on is committing resources to action. And this is the second big area of action under the action plan for Oregon this year. And that is building connections and understanding between agencies within Oregon through description of how our agency mandates connect to ocean change, policies we already have in effect, monitoring we already have in effect, and the opportunities for building on those existing programs moving forward and seeing that as a real opportunity. It says audio connection is restored. Hopefully you guys can still hear me.
Yes, I can still hear you.
Great. So moving on, and I'm almost done, is that in addition to working on kind of agency connections and planning over the next 5 years, in addition to building our products and our goals around education and outreach and awareness on this topic, we have a number of other things that are going on. First, within my agency, as an example only, we have a policy that is being presented to our Fish and Wildlife Commission on climate and ocean change, really focusing on applying a lens of climate and ocean change across all of the actions that the Fish and Wildlife Agency is doing in terms of management, research, and policy, and making sure that that's integrated into our thinking and planning on the long term, both adapting to it, but then hopefully also providing capacity to mitigate some of the changes and at least lessen their impacts. Outside of the agency, really across all Oregon agencies, this year we'll see the development, the finalization of the second version of the Oregon Climate Adaptation Framework, which is really, the first one was in 2010, and so this is the 10-year update, and it's really intended to drive the interagency discussions about how we can connect to each other and make decisions moving forward that aren't in conflict. And so that will be finalized this year and is very consistent with some of the things I've already described. Another couple of things are upcoming and at least planned. There's legislation that was presented in our session in February that unfortunately was not passed because essentially our legislature was not able to finish its business this session due to controversy over carbon legislation. We also have upcoming process on agency budgets and building new initiatives into agency budgets, the planning I already mentioned, and the education and outreach. But I do want to also focus on, in closing, our partners, the Department of Environmental Quality, which is our water quality agency for the state of Oregon. And they, for the first time, have included ocean acidification in their proposal, in their integrated report that is going to be submitted to the EPA this coming April. And in that, ocean acidification is listed as Category 3 concern for Oregon, but they've also included as I believe a Category 5 shellfish harvest being impacted by harmful algal blooms within that integrated report. So I would just call out their leadership and thoughtful approach to really thinking about ocean change and how to build that into Oregon's potential designation of waterways being impacted. So here's the legislation that did not pass. I'm just pausing because I'm still sad that it did not get the time, the public discourse that it deserved. There's a number of research projects and investments that would have been funded through the state bill. And I think really ending with this is more a flag that while we are making a lot of progress, we still have a lot of work to do to bring ocean issues into focus, even within our discussions around terrestrial impacts from climate change. And we continue to be challenged by whether climate and ocean change are a priority or not, both within the state as well as obviously nationally and internationally. So with that, I'll just commit. We have a lot of work to do. We're doing a lot of work in Oregon, and I'm proud of that work as well as on the West Coast, and grateful for the time to talk to you about it today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Karen. I just want to remind our audience to go ahead and type your questions into the question box. Okay, our first question is, in Oregon's action plan, what kind of water management tools are you using to know what causes of current ocean acidification is raising levels?
That's a great question. In the action plan, we are essentially taking that question, and then essentially that question is asked in our action plan. It's directed towards the Department of Environmental Quality, who is one of the agency members on the Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Council, and really is nested within the bullet of agency planning. In our state in particular, we do not have the massive population centers right on the coast that are more typical of our neighbors to the north and to the south, as well as the East Coast. And so one of the questions that remains for Oregon is how much are our coastal waterways being impacted by the ocean signal versus the terrestrial local signals of ocean acidification exacerbation factors. And so that is something that we've asked the Department of Environmental Quality to dig into more for us as our water quality expert agency. It's an ongoing kind of question mark for Oregon. We have very strong ocean signals, and we just don't really quite know the magnitude of what that terrestrial signal is yet. So more to be defined through agency planning and evaluation of where we are on that topic. And we expect more on that next year.
Great, thank you so much. I think we have time for one more question. You mentioned the move from statements of support to actual appropriations. Besides time, what are the major impediments to that? Is it a question of finite resources?
I think I understand what the question is. We have a lot of barriers, and I'll speak for probably all of us on the phone. When I say this, I've already mentioned the difficulty of trying to knit together climate and ocean issues, which has been a barrier in policy as well as funding. But funding is always a barrier. There's limited funding. And the work that we're doing in Oregon is funded by general fund, it's funded by federal funds, it's funded by private entities and NGOs. So we have a diversity of funding. The other barriers that we have are really in prioritizing actions, and Justine very nicely went through discussion of SAVs as an example, submerged aquatic vegetation, and there was another question about whether kelp was part of that discussion or just seagrass. That discussion just today highlights some of the problems that we have. Should we invest in kelp? Should we invest in eelgrass? Where should we invest in eelgrass? How can we effectively restore or protect seagrass if it is in fact meaningful? And there's a number of questions there that need to be resolved before we can apply the limited resources that we have. So I'd say knowledge is a barrier in some cases. And in other cases, we do have barriers in policy, including things like our current statements around water quality criteria are not effective at identifying problems in water quality for ocean acidification metrics, nor acting on those. And so that's been recognized and acknowledged, but still has not been fixed, and will take additional thought and action in order to fix that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have a few extra questions, but we're going to try to use them at our question and answer period at the end. Thank you, Karen. I think we are now going to move to the East Coast. Our last speaker is Donald Witherell. Donald has worked for the Maine Department of Environmental Protection since 1971. From 1994 through 2012, he was the director of the Division of Watershed Management. Since 2012, Don has been the director of the Division of Environmental Assessment, which he is responsible for monitoring and assessing Maine surface waters and providing biennial reports on Maine's water quality. Don has participated on the steering committee of the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership, I know as MOCA, I think they call it, since June of 2018. And he is currently a member of Maine's Climate Council Coastal and Marine Work Group. Don, take it away.
Great, thank you, Holly, and hello, everybody. Good to be here. And just one correction on the bio, which is that I've actually been with the Maine DEP since 1979, not 71. So it 40 years, but still a good amount of time. So my discussion on, I'm going to be talking on 3 topics. So yeah, I want to talk about 3 aspects of legislation in the state of Maine, starting with the 2014 Legislative Commission, which really got things going here. There certainly was more discussions prior to that, but I think that's a good kicking off place, because that's where things really picked up, and then transition to discussion about MOCA, and then finally what's ongoing with the climate change legislation we have in Maine as well. It was mentioned at the outset that Maine is one of the states that's successfully enacted legislation, and while that's true to a certain extent, I think we still look at it as work in progress. And so with that, we'll keep going here, which takes us to the 2014 legislation that passed. So I want to point out that it was a resolve that established a commission, and the commission was to study the effects of coastal and ocean acidification and its existing and potential effects on species that are commercially harvested. So that language is important because this was a tough sell politically. It was, as you can see on the slide, it was actually a law that went into effect without the governor's signature. The interest wasn't actually broadening it out for climate change, but because of, again, politics, it was felt that if it was more focused on commercially harvested species and just focusing on ocean to coastal acidification, that it would have a better opportunity. And in fact, that's what happened. It did pass. So it was a fairly short duration commission. It came into effect again summer of 2014. The group, which included legislators, scientists, state agency people, other NGOs participated. They met pretty much monthly through that fall and came up with a final report in January. So it was a very quick process. They did come up with 6 goals that they recommended, which if we can go to those. The first one was, and these goals, by the way, will look very familiar because as I was looking at Oregon's OAH action plan in the themes, it seems like there's some common threads throughout these goals. The first one, which is to invest in the capacity to monitor and investigate ocean acidification and the impacts on commercially important species. This has been a common theme throughout our discussions, both during that period and since. The second one was reducing emissions on carbon dioxide. This has also been a strong focus in the current legislation. Thirdly, the identifying land-based nutrients, and this was in recognition of the difference between coastal and ocean acidification. And there was a lot of discussion about the fact that we could do something about coastal acidification as opposed to ocean acidification. So there was a lot of attention given there. Increasing the capacity to mitigate, remediate, and adapt. Again, that was a common theme, that we need increased resources and better coordination to do that. The need to communicate, to inform stakeholders, public and decision makers about OA, and give people the tools to take action. And then lastly, keep this going. The concern was that this was not going to be a one and done proposition, that we would really need to continue this process following that 2015 report. So the report sunsetted the commission, and so one of the things they did recommend, and they actually introduced legislation, was to create an ongoing OCA council that would be responsible for carrying out these recommendations. The problem was there was no funding, so the legislation failed. But what they did say was that it would be fine to have a volunteer effort to carry on. You can go to the next. And hence what's the formation of the Maine Ocean and Coastal Acidification Partnership, known as MOCA. And so it did spawn out a number of the players that were involved in the 2014 commission remained active, including several legislators that have remained active to this day. MOCA has continued to advance those goals that were listed, and so they've been a forum for bringing the public together, bringing stakeholders together, and continuing to discuss what the issues are, and also to advance those concerns to what is currently now the Maine Climate Council, which I'll get to in a moment. So MOCA, again, it's a relatively large group of people, but there is a smaller group that's the steering committee, of which, as was previously mentioned, I've been involved with since 2018. The people in this photo, most of them are currently very active members, and again, it's a diversity of people, and that's been one of the keys, is that we have legislators, state agency people, people from the industry, as well as nonprofits and educators, all involved in advancing the work of MOCA. The group has come together and has sponsored a number of symposia and other events advancing the discussion about ocean and coastal acidification. We've had several policy meetings in recent years, and most recently, this past summer in July, we held 3 meetings, which were focused on research monitoring, policy and law, and resiliency and adaptation. And those were to develop a recommended action plan to send to our Maine Climate Council, which I'll get to here in a moment. Again, the partnership has a diversity of individuals. This was taken back in 2016 as the group was coming together at the State House, and this was a strategy session to advance the work. So going back to last summer's workshops and the development of the action plan, again, some very common themes in terms of the direction we felt that we need to be taking. identifying funding to support strategies and actions, continuing to build on efforts and enhance budgets so that we can continue monitoring and recognizing critical roles that municipalities and people in aquaculture and others are playing and will play to address climate change. These all resulted in a series of some additional recommendations. We can go to the next slide. So starting with the first one, which continues to be a problem that we have not been able to address. And so I come from the environmental water quality monitoring perspective at the main DEP. And we have the problem of not having sufficient funding to do a coast-wide monitoring program. And we do have areas that we monitor, but they tend to be site-specific to existing discharges, as well as we're doing some monitoring in conjunction with other local groups, the Casco Bay Estuary Partnership being one where we collect quite a bit of data. But the efforts are not coordinated. It's not a comprehensive statewide program. And so we've been trying in various ways to approach how we can sustain a statewide monitoring program. Secondly, in recognition that there is no one-size-fits-all solution and that communities lack resources and need help in assessing how to adapt to climate change. This includes managing for increased storm intensities, both on the water and over the land, and developing, in some cases, municipal ordinances to help manage those activities. Strategies may include localized pilot remediation projects, development or expansion of aquaculture, increased license access for emerging species, and strategies to help shift from single species management to more integrated plans. The state should provide resources, training, and education to help those whose livelihoods are being impacted by climate change. And we should be enforcing regulations that reduce land-based impacts, particularly concerns for increased levels of nitrogen in coastal waters for point and non-point sources, and the recommendation that we should review existing stormwater regulations to deal with the land-based source. Requiring relevant state and municipal plans and permits to address climate change. So it's, again, a broader focus than just ocean and coastal acidification. The reference to ocean climate change was the state should use its regulatory authority to steer activities to those that do not harm coastal and marine environments. So shifting gears to where we are today with the Climate Council. As I previously mentioned, MOCA has been providing a bridge to ocean coastal acidification from the 2014 Commission and the current Climate Council. And while Maine's reemerged as a state to fight climate change, there's been a lot of groundwork laid already. Maine's Climate Action Plan, adopted in 2004, has resulted in several updates on progress and other reports focused on assessment, adaptation, and preparedness. But it's all currently leading to what is the ongoing work. So Governor Mills took office on January 3rd of 2019. She made combating climate change a key strategy in her inaugural address, emphasizing it with her statement, "Enough with the studies, talk, and debate. It is time to act." The Maine Climate Council bill was enacted last spring. It established new targets for greenhouse gas emissions. It also created the Climate Council and a deadline for updating the Climate Action Plan. And that will be due in December 1st. And An executive order was signed to achieve state carbon neutrality by 2045, and the Climate Council is tasked with including recommendations on how to achieve that neutrality in the action plan. So the council and how it operates has about 39 members, including 4 legislators, department heads, NGO reps, scientists, industry reps, and even a representative of Maine Youth and others. The kickoff meeting for this group was on September 26th. Most of the work is now focused through the steering committee, the science and technical subcommittee, and the working groups listed across the bottom, of which the Coastal and Marine Working Group, which I am a member of, is focused on ocean coastal acidification as part of the strategies that we are working on. The Science and Technical Subcommittee has been very active, has issued a phase 1 report to inform its work groups. Recommendations with respect to ocean and coastal acidification are included and in a lot of ways mirror the recommendations that came from the Commission back in 2014, although the science has been advanced to reflect what we know today. So the work groups are currently where a lot of activity is going right now. The groups have 30 to 40 members. They're further divided into subcommittees. Currently on the ocean, or in the Coastal and Marine Working Group, we're working on both developing mitigation and adaptation strategies. So we're focusing on monitoring on how such things as a blue carbon strategy, looking at how to protect and enhance seagrass, and looking at how we can sustain or how we can actually improve monitoring in order to better assess what we actually have and where we need to go. So the timeline for all this, as indicated, that we are currently in the phase where the working groups are developing those strategies. There will be a stakeholder and public engagement opportunity happening over the next couple of months. The strategies recommendations are due to the Climate Council by June 30th of this year. They will then be working on it and developing a update to our state climate action plan, and that will be due December 1st to be updated every 4 years. In addition, there will be annual progress reports submitted to the legislature in January of each year. The legislature will then be authorized to report out bills to implement. And so it all sounds very encouraging. And the big concern, of course, is, and we've heard it already here today, it's the funding aspect. Where does the money come from? And I think that's going to continue to be our struggle as we go forward. I also just wanted to point out, since it was mentioned earlier about the International Alliance, that Maine has become a member. We formally joined in January, so we're pleased to be part of that organization. I do want to give some thanks to some of my colleagues. Esperanza Santiago, who is currently heading up the MOCA group, Ivy Frinoka, who is the Casco Bay keeper with French Casco Bay, who was the former head of the MOCA group, and they both are currently very active in the Climate Council working groups, and as well as Cassandra Rose, who is the senior science analyst with the Governor's Office's Policy of Innovation in the Future. And my thanks to all of them for contributing the slides for this presentation. So with that, I think we can take any questions.
Thank you, Don. Excellent. Yes, we will take some questions. Before we move into the questions, I just wanted to let everyone know that the certificate is now available to download from the handouts panel. And if your question doesn't get answered today, you can reach out to the speakers directly. I do see some of the questions are coming in. The first question is, from the main coastal and marine work group under the Climate Council, what sort of specific strategy are they entertaining as part of blue carbon and seagrass? What are the opportunities?
So yeah, and that is still a work in progress in terms of what we need to do. I mean, I think number one is, and this links back to our monitoring, is that first we need to have a baseline, and we need to establish, what we have for eelgrass beds. We have good information in places, but not coast-wide. So first thing is to basically establish that baseline information, and we need to really figure out what things do we need to do to protect and perhaps even enhance those eelgrass beds. For instance, it may be limiting mooring fields in certain areas if we find that there is habitat for eelgrass. So it's along those lines of basically trying to protect the beds we've got once we know exactly where they are.
Great. One question here is there any connection between legacy waste sites in Maine that have acid leakage and coastal acidification?
I'm not aware of any sites where we've documented that problem. I mean, it certainly could be a local issue, but it's not come up in our conversations. So.
Okay, I'm just going through the questions here. Can you describe how you are investing in Maine's capacity to monitor to determine what is causing the increased acidification levels in Maine?
So again, the investment in monitoring, which it showed up back in the 2015 Commission report, it showed up in MOCA's action plan, and it will show up again in our recommendations to the Climate Council. So the monitoring that's happening right now, and in my division at the Environmental Protection Department, we have a marine monitoring unit that has 4 individuals, but only 2 individuals who can actually devote time in terms of doing the monitoring work. And so the problem is we do not have the resources to do a statewide monitoring program, and so we continually indicate that that's a shortcoming in our state program that needs to be addressed. We've had conversations. There was actually a bill that passed in the legislature last session, but was not funded, which would actually would provide for resources to do statewide monitoring of eelgrass. We've discussed, the hang-up being the funding. Where do we get funding for it? We've talked about such things as doing an add-on to the boat registration fee as a source of revenue. And I noticed in the polling prior to the presentations here, I think it was 1% said boat fees I'd be curious where that 1% is in the country, because we haven't heard of any place where they have successfully used boat fees, but it seemed like a potential for us, because we actually do something similar in freshwater, where we have what we call our milfoil sticker program, where boats have to pay to help us combat aquatic invasive species. That only applies in freshwater. It doesn't apply in the marine environment. And the thought was that if we had a similar fee that could go towards marine monitoring work, it would be beneficial to the users in the coastal waters. But so far there hasn't been any traction on that one. So we're still looking for funding.
Okay, great. I have another funding question, and let me know if you think you've already answered this. will the Climate Council and MOCA's recommendation become more embedded and create more sustainable funding for work over the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, that's our hope. I mean, certainly MOCA had picked up the ball on this and promoted it and continues to promote it. I fully expect that this will be a strong recommendation that comes at least from the Coastal Marine Working Group, that monitoring is such a core activity that it needs to get a focus, it needs to be funded. But the concern is once it gets to the Climate Council, and even if it advances, it still ends up competing for funding when it gets to the legislature. And, in these uncertain times, with what we now know is going to be a big issue with our current public health problems, who knows? But we will continue to push it.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we can move to the questions from our other speakers. How will Maine explore local solutions for the Gulf of Maine, such as shellfish habitat restoration and shell recycling programs?
So yeah, we certainly have been discussing such things such as using shell hash. There's been a project that Casco Bay Partnership has been involved with to look at the use of shell hash as a way of locally dealing with acidification concerns. But I think we will look to partner with local groups wherever we can, but there's not really anything specific at this point on the table.
Okay. Great. Okay, so we still have a few questions remaining from our other speakers. I'm going to move to the questions to Justine. Justine, are you still there?
Yep.
Okay, great. So we had a question for you. Are there plans to expand the physical biogeochemical model to the central northern California coast?
Yeah, so the model at the lowest resolution, I'm not a modeler, does include the full California current. And we do have a section that has been downscaled for all of California. But we've been focusing on the Southern California bight, where we have it down to a 300-meter resolution, I believe. And we have been discussing plans, particularly around San Francisco Bay and Monterey, to do a similar higher resolution modeling scenarios up there. So we are considering it, but it is just going to really depend on what resources we have over the next couple of years and where we can put those. But they are already working on something in San Francisco Bay and Monterey with SFEI, San Francisco Bay Estuary Institute, I believe is the acronym. And so they have already started some of that work, but to get it to the point where we're at now with Southern California bight will take quite a bit more funding. And so that's just dependent on that. Okay, great. I think this is a general question, but I'm going to give it to Karin. Could you help explain what is the relationship between ocean acidification and hypoxia, and why are these impacts often coupled?
Yeah, thanks. I will do my best. I am not a chemical oceanographer, but here is an ecologist's version of what those connections are for the area around Oregon. And I stress that because I think the relationship between the two differs depending on where you are on the globe. But for Oregon, our ocean change characteristics I described are the seasonal upwelling of nutrient-rich acidified waters, and particularly with the marine heat wave, we've had fairly warm conditions as well. And so this has really facilitated harmful algal blooms, but algal blooms generally. And that's what our coast is known for, is highly productive coastal waters that support very biodiverse, thriving ocean ecosystems. So that summer upwelling and acidified water actually can favor some of the algal species and cause those to bloom. But even if they're just, so it favors productivity, and as those blooms die and settle and decompose, creates these increasing pockets, benthic pockets of hypoxic water. And so you see these growing in space and time as the summer progresses. Now, the connection with acidified waters in particular is that these harmful algal blooms we're learning more and more that they are favored and grow more intensely during with acidified conditions. And so there's a biofeedback there of the acidified conditions increasing blooms, which increases productivity, but also increases decomposition and depletion of oxygen on the benthos. So that's what we're seeing, and that's different from terrestrial nutrient driven dead zones that you think about for the Mississippi River, for example. But the outcome is similar. You get this nutrient push, you get the biological productivity responding, and then the decomposition process depletes oxygen.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, this is really for any of the panelists. You can answer this question. Excellent presentations from active states on the coastline. What can states do that are not on the coastline to support actions and initiatives against ocean acidification?
Send us money.
Control of greenhouse gas emissions. I'll steal Justine's line.
I agree.
Okay.
I think I might add just one other, which is related to my previous comment. For states that are inland but have watersheds that connect to ocean systems, land-based local control of nutrients, water quality, whether it's agricultural impacts, sewage impacts, other sedimentation impacts, those are all going to impact the area where those waters exit to the ocean.
Okay, great. I'm going to ask, I think, just one last question. Let me look at this list here. Have we seen any studies that correlate the erosion on the coastline to ocean acidification? I think this is maybe particular to California, but it could be anywhere.
I haven't seen any such study. I'm not aware of anything. I don't know, Karin, are you familiar?
No, I mean, what I'm aware of is kind of the obvious. That's sea level and then intensity of storms that are really ongoingly connected to and correlated with erosion, coastal erosion. I haven't seen anything and can't think of a mechanism for ocean acidification or hypoxia connecting to erosion directly.
And I guess I'll add from a Maine perspective, we haven't measured a connection between coastal erosion, but we have, and one of our council members, Bill Moog from Moog Sea Farms, They do aquaculture, and they have measured the impacts of increased stormwater runoff. Basically, after storm events, we see a lowering pH in the water. So that's something we have measured, and it's something that we are certainly focused on.
Excellent. Okay, I think we have one last question here, and this could be for any of the speakers. What is the most helpful in terms of tackling ocean acidification in your positions? Is it more funding in general, more information sharing and collaboration with other states and federal agencies, ocean user support, for example, fishermen and shellfish hatchery? What is the most helpful in the work that you do personally?
For Oregon, I think that we are most significantly impacted by funding constraints. But I also mentioned in my talk that there are situations where we would like to invest funding if we could get it, but we don't know exactly how to invest it. And the issue of seagrasses in particular is perplexing exactly how to make progress on that, both from a funding and a knowledge perspective.
For California, yeah, sorry, it was what is most helpful, or what has been most supportive in the work that you do?
Mm-hmm. What could help you the most in your position?
Oh, I think, and we've talked about this, but we have really great working relationships and partnerships with the scientific community and with our neighboring states and agencies. But going forward, I think it would be really helpful to even better coordinate all the efforts that are ongoing into these sort of synthesized products and messages that we could all be using. And so I think we're at a point now where we have all this really great science, but there's maybe a need to just do a better job of analyzing and synthesizing and reporting that all together. So that would be really helpful for us, because we have a lot of science that's informing what we do, but in terms of sort of the synthesized work products that we can message, there's still sometimes, different sources with slightly different information. So going forward, that'll be a priority for us.
And I think for me, I think for us, it would be having the resources in order to have a sustainable long-term monitoring program. I think that would be the thing that'd be number one on our wish list right now.
Great. Thank you so much to our excellent speakers. I really thank you so much for doing this. I know everybody's doing this from home right now, so I really appreciate it. And that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much. As a reminder, the certificate for this webcast is available in the handouts panel on your side of your screen. Today's presentation was recorded and should be posted within the next month. You can find a full list of our previous webcasts that you can also watch at EPA's Watershed Academy website. We are currently planning our next webcast and hope that you will visit our website in the next coming week as we post additional details on this subject or speakers and how to register. One quick reminder, please fill out the evaluation that will appear on your screen after the webinar. And at this time, I'd like to conclude today's webinar. Thank you to our amazing speakers, and that ends our webcast for today. Thank you for joining us.